Results of an independent autopsy report in the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells have been released. The cause and manner of death have been ruled undetermined, but civil rights attorney Ben Crump says foul play cannot be ruled out. Crump announced the findings during a press conference this morning where Nolan Wells' parents also pleaded for more transparency.
After weeks of unanswered questions, conflicting witness accounts, and countless theories spreading across social media, the Nolan Wells investigation has reached a turning point. Not because someone finally confessed, not because investigators announced an arrest, and not because a missing piece of digital evidence suddenly surfaced. This breakthrough came from somewhere far quieter, inside an examination room, buried beneath layers of tissue, hidden where no one could see it. For the first time since 18-year-old Nolan Wells disappeared after a July 4th boating trip near Horn Island, investigators now have a documented physical finding that wasn't part of endless online speculation or competing eyewitness stories. An independent forensic examination identified a 12 by 8-inch area of red discoloration deep beneath the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. It's a finding that immediately raises difficult questions. What caused it? Was it the result of something that happened before Nolan entered the water? Could it have occurred during the drowning process itself? Was it related to how his body was recovered, or does it point investigators towards something they haven't yet considered? Right now, no one has those answers. And perhaps the most important detail of all is this: the forensic pathologist who documented the finding has not ruled out foul play. At the same time, he has not concluded that foul play occurred either. That distinction matters. In high-profile investigations, it's easy for one sentence to become a headline and one headline to become accepted as fact. But this case has already shown how quickly speculation can outrun evidence. Every new development has sparked thousands of opinions online, each claiming certainty while investigators themselves continue searching for verified answers. Today, we're doing something different. We're separating what has actually been documented from what people merely believe. We'll walk through exactly what the independent autopsy found, why forensic experts consider this discovery significant, what investigators still don't know, and why this single medical finding could influence every future stage of the investigation, from toxicology results to digital evidence, and possibly even grand jury proceedings. Because despite what you've probably seen online, this discovery doesn't solve the mystery. It changes the questions. If you're interested in following verified developments instead of rumors, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Cases like this evolve one documented fact at a time, and we'll continue separating confirmed evidence from speculation as new information becomes available. To understand why this newly documented finding matters, we have to go back to where this investigation began. When Nolan Wells first disappeared, investigators weren't looking at physical forensic evidence that could explain what happened during his final moments. Instead, nearly every discussion centered around pieces of information that, while important, depended heavily on interpretation. There were witness statements. Some appeared consistent, others raised new questions. As more people came forward describing what they remembered from that day, differences in timing, conversations, and observations naturally emerged. Investigators collected each account, knowing that memories can vary, especially during stressful events. No single statement could tell the entire story on its own. Then there was cell phone evidence. Digital records became another major focus as investigators worked to reconstruct Nolan's final hours. Reports surrounding location data, communications, and activity generated enormous public interest. Every reported timestamp seemed to produce another theory about where Nolan had been, what he may have been doing, or what happened in the minutes before he vanished. GPS information from the boat added another layer to the timeline, helping investigators better understand the vessel's movements throughout the day. While useful for reconstructing events, GPS alone could never explain everything. It could show where the boat traveled, but not necessarily what happened to every person aboard. Meanwhile, social media became flooded with screenshots, amateur analyses, and viral videos. Some posts claimed to reveal hidden clues, others confidently declared the case solved, yet many of those claims relied on assumptions rather than evidence, making it increasingly difficult for the public to separate verified facts from speculation. As the weeks passed, the investigation became surrounded by competing theories. Some believed the evidence pointed toward a tragic accident. Others argued that critical pieces of the story still didn't fit. Every new rumor seemed to create two more. And through it all, one question remained unanswered. What did the forensic evidence actually show? That's what makes today's development fundamentally different from everything that came before. For the first time, investigators, and Nolan's family, weren't examining another statement, another social media post, or another interpretation of digital evidence. They were examining Nolan himself. Unlike witness testimony, medical findings don't rely on memory. Unlike online speculation, they aren't shaped by public opinion. They are documented observations made during a forensic examination, carefully recorded so they can be evaluated alongside every other piece of evidence. That doesn't mean every finding immediately provides an answer. Far from it. Sometimes, a single observation creates even more questions than it resolves. But it does mean investigators finally have something tangible to examine, something measurable, something that exists independently of conflicting accounts. For Nolan's family, that distinction became incredibly important. As weeks turned into months, they continued searching for clarity. Like many families facing unexplained deaths, they wanted reassurance that every possible avenue had been explored. Every injury examined, every question asked, every conclusion tested. That desire ultimately led them to request something that has become increasingly common in high-profile investigations: an independent autopsy. Rather than relying solely on the original examination, the family sought an experienced forensic pathologist who had no connection to Mississippi authorities. Their goal wasn't to challenge the investigation for the sake of disagreement. It was to ensure that every finding would be reviewed independently, with fresh eyes, and without influence from earlier conclusions. In cases surrounded by intense public attention, independent examinations often serve an important role. They can confirm previous findings, identify additional observations, or simply provide families with greater confidence that nothing has been overlooked. No one knew whether this second examination would reveal anything new. It might have confirmed every conclusion reached during the original autopsy. Or, it might uncover something no one had publicly discussed before. The independent examination did not begin under ideal circumstances. By the time Nolan's family arranged for a second autopsy, the state's original examination had already been completed. That timing would become one of the most important details in understanding everything that followed. Unlike an initial autopsy, where every anatomical structure is available for examination, an independent review performed afterward can only evaluate what remains accessible. That limitation doesn't make the examination less valuable. It simply means the forensic pathologist must work with the evidence still available while carefully documenting both what can and cannot be determined. From the beginning, the examination followed the same methodical process used in forensic investigations across the country. Every visible injury was documented. Every area of the body was examined. Internal structures were inspected one by one, searching for signs that might explain how Nolan died. Given the amount of speculation surrounding the case, many people expected the second autopsy to uncover dramatic evidence of severe trauma. But that isn't what happened. The pathologist found no skull fractures, no widespread blunt force trauma, no broken bones, no major external injuries across the body, no deep tissue injuries suggesting extensive physical violence. Those findings were significant in themselves because they ruled out several possibilities people had debated online for weeks. The examination did not reveal the kind of catastrophic injuries many had assumed might be present. For a moment, it appeared the second autopsy might simply reinforce the state's earlier findings. Then the examination reached the back of Nolan's head. Deep beneath the surface, within the soft tissue covering the rear portion of his skull, the pathologist documented something unexpected. An area of red discoloration measuring approximately 12 inches by 8 inches. Not a cut, not an open wound, not a laceration visible from the outside, and importantly, not accompanied by a skull fracture. That distinction cannot be overstated. If someone hears there was a mark on the head, it's easy to imagine an obvious external injury. But that's not what was documented. According to the independent examination, this was an internal finding located within the soft tissue beneath the scalp. It wasn't something that could simply be observed by looking at Nolan's head. Naturally, one question immediately followed. What caused it? The forensic pathologist didn't claim to know. And that's exactly why this finding has become so important. In forensic medicine, documenting an observation and identifying its cause are two very different things. Experts are trained not to leap from one to the other without supporting evidence. Instead, they carefully record what they see, preserve the findings, and compare them with every other piece of evidence collected during the investigation. So while the discoloration stood out enough to be specifically documented, the examination alone could not definitively explain why it was there. Could it have resulted from an impact? Possibly. Could it be associated with the drowning process? That also remained a possibility. Could it have developed after death through natural post-mortem changes? That too had to be considered. Or could it have occurred during the recovery or handling of Nolan's body? Investigators could not immediately exclude that explanation either. Each possibility remained on the table. And that's where responsible forensic science differs from public speculation. Rather than selecting the explanation that seems most dramatic, investigators compare every medical finding with witness accounts, environmental conditions, digital evidence, and laboratory testing before reaching conclusions. The discoloration was not labeled as proof of homicide, nor was it dismissed as meaningless. It became something else entirely, a documented forensic observation requiring further evaluation. That may sound like a small distinction, but in an investigation surrounded by conflicting narratives, it represents a major shift. Until now, so much of the conversation focused on interpreting what people said they saw or remembered. This finding wasn't based on recollection. It was physically observed during examination. That alone gives investigators a concrete piece of evidence they can continue analyzing as additional information becomes available. If you've found this breakdown helpful so far, consider subscribing. Our goal isn't to amplify rumors. It's to carefully examine verified developments as they emerge. In cases like this, understanding the evidence often means understanding what investigators still don't know. And despite this important discovery, the independent pathologist faced another obstacle, one that may prove just as significant as the finding itself. Several critical anatomical structures were no longer available for examination. Those missing structures would prevent the pathologist from independently answering one of the investigation's most important questions. And because of that limitation, one possibility could neither be confirmed nor ruled out. The discovery of the discoloration wasn't the only thing that shaped the independent autopsy. Just as important was what the forensic pathologist could not examine. By the time the second autopsy began, several key anatomical structures had already been retained during the state's original examination. That meant the independent pathologist had no opportunity to inspect them firsthand or reach his own conclusions about their condition. Among those retained structures were the trachea, the hyoid bone, and surrounding tissues within the neck. To most people, those names may not sound significant, but in forensic investigations they often are. When medical examiners investigate deaths where neck trauma is a possibility, these structures can provide valuable information. They are examined for fractures, hemorrhaging, or other signs that may indicate injury before death. Their condition is considered alongside every other finding, never in isolation. In Nolan's case, the independent pathologist simply didn't have access to those areas. Because of that, he could not independently determine whether they showed evidence of injury or whether they appeared entirely normal. That limitation became one of the report's most important conclusions. The pathologist stated that he could not rule out injury to the neck as a contributing factor in Nolan's death. It's a statement that has often been misunderstood. Saying something cannot be ruled out is not the same as saying it happened. Forensic experts routinely acknowledge uncertainty when evidence is incomplete. Doing so reflects the limits of the available information, rather than suggesting a specific conclusion. Had those structures been available, the independent examiner might have confirmed there was no neck injury at all, or he might have identified findings that required further investigation. Because they weren't available, neither conclusion could be reached independently. As a result, one important question remains unanswered. Were there any injuries to the neck that played a role in Nolan's death? At this stage, the independent autopsy cannot answer that question. And it wasn't the only unanswered question investigators were still waiting on. Another critical piece of evidence had yet to arrive: the toxicology report. Although it often receives less public attention than autopsy findings, toxicology can play a decisive role in determining how investigators interpret a death. These laboratory tests look for the presence of alcohol, prescription medications, recreational drugs, and other substances that may have affected a person's condition before death. They can also help investigators eliminate possibilities rather than simply confirm them. In drowning investigations especially, toxicology is an important part of the overall picture. Medical examiners don't rely on one piece of evidence. They compare laboratory results with the autopsy findings, the recovery scene, environmental conditions, and the known timeline before reaching a final opinion. That's why, at the time of the independent examination, the cause and manner of Nolan's death were not finalized. The independent pathologist classified both as undetermined pending further investigation. That wording is important. It does not identify homicide, it does not confirm an accident, and it does not conclude that drowning alone explains everything that happened. Instead, it reflects that additional evidence is still required before a final determination can responsibly be made. For investigators, every remaining piece of evidence now has greater significance because it must be evaluated alongside the documented discoloration, the unavailable neck structures, and the findings that were ruled out during the examination. If you're finding value in following the evidence step by step, instead of jumping to conclusions, consider subscribing. As more official findings become public, we'll continue breaking them down carefully so you can understand what they actually mean and what they don't. With the forensic evidence still incomplete, investigators had to return to another critical part of the case: the timeline. Because understanding what happened to Nolan in his final hours requires more than medical findings alone. It requires reconstructing his movements, the boat's location, the environmental conditions around Horn Island, and the sequence of events leading up to the moment he disappeared. Only by placing those pieces together can investigators begin comparing the physical evidence with what is known about Nolan's final day. By this point in the investigation, the forensic evidence and the timeline had become inseparable. Neither could answer the case alone. Medical findings might explain whether Nolan suffered an injury. The timeline could help determine when and where that injury might have occurred, if it occurred at all. Investigators already had several pieces of the day's chronology established through GPS records and emergency communications. On the morning of July 4th, Nolan and several friends left the dock aboard a recreational boat headed toward Horn Island, one of the barrier islands off Mississippi's Gulf Coast. The trip was expected to be like countless others during the Independence Day holiday, a day on the water with friends before returning home that evening. GPS data later confirmed the boat's movements throughout much of the day. It departed the dock in the morning and eventually reached Horn Island. Hours later, the vessel left the island. But one person wasn't on board: Nolan Wells. At some point during the afternoon, it became clear that he was missing. The situation quickly shifted from confusion to emergency as those on the boat realized they could not account for him. A call requesting assistance was eventually made, triggering a search effort involving multiple agencies. From there, the investigation entered a race against time. Search teams began working across the waters surrounding Horn Island, focusing on the areas where Nolan was believed to have last been seen. Boats combed the shoreline while aircraft and marine units searched from above and below, hoping to locate him before darkness and changing conditions complicated the operation even further. When Nolan's body was eventually recovered, investigators immediately began comparing the recovery location with the known movements of the boat, witness statements, and environmental conditions. That final element, the environment itself, would become increasingly important. Experienced volunteer search personnel familiar with the waters surrounding Horn Island described one particular area near the island's northwestern side as especially dangerous. Local rescuers have long referred to it by an unforgettable nickname: the washing machine. It's not an official designation. It's a description earned through experience. The name reflects how powerful currents can collide in that area, creating constantly shifting water movement that is difficult to predict even for experienced boaters and swimmers. Water depths can change rapidly, and the force of the current may pull someone away from where they initially entered the water. Search professionals have explained that incidents in conditions like these often unfold quietly. Unlike dramatic portrayals in movies, drownings frequently occur without shouting or prolonged struggles. Strong currents can quickly overwhelm even capable swimmers, particularly if they become disoriented or exhausted. Those observations are important, but they are not conclusions about Nolan's case. Investigators cannot simply assume that environmental hazards explain what happened. Instead, they compare those conditions against every available piece of evidence. If the physical findings, witness accounts, and environmental factors all align, investigators gain confidence in their reconstruction of events. If they don't, additional questions emerge. That careful process is exactly why the investigation remains active. There are still pieces of evidence that require further examination. One of those involves Nolan's cell phone. Digital devices often become silent witnesses in modern investigations. They can reveal movement, communication, application activity, and location data that help establish a timeline independent of human memory. In Nolan's case, investigators have continued examining reported issues involving cell phone data, including discussions surrounding Snapchat activity, Life 360 location information, and reported gaps in digital records. Those topics have generated enormous public attention because many people believe the phone could help clarify Nolan's final movements. However, digital evidence must be analyzed carefully. A missing message doesn't automatically indicate wrongdoing. A location discrepancy doesn't necessarily establish criminal conduct. Applications record information differently. Signals can be interrupted. Devices may lose connectivity, and investigators must verify every digital record before drawing conclusions. The same careful approach applies to witness testimony. Investigators have collected statements from individuals who were with Nolan during portions of that day, including accounts regarding the final conversations before he disappeared. As is common in complex investigations, some recollections differ in timing or detail. That doesn't automatically mean anyone is being deceptive. People experience stressful situations differently, and memories often vary, especially when events unfold rapidly. Rather than treating one account as definitive, investigators compare every statement with GPS records, digital evidence, forensic findings, and physical evidence. Areas of agreement strengthen the timeline. Areas of conflict become subjects for additional investigation. The same standard has been applied to videos and images circulating online. Several clips have gone viral, with countless users claiming they reveal hidden evidence or prove a particular theory. Investigators, however, have consistently distinguished between verified evidence and disputed interpretations, recognizing that viral content often spreads much faster than confirmed facts. Today, every one of those unresolved questions has taken on added importance because they must now be evaluated alongside the independent autopsy's documented findings. The investigation is no longer centered on a single mystery. It's about determining how every verified piece of evidence fits together, and whether they all point toward the same explanation, or toward one that investigators have yet to uncover. As investigators continued assembling evidence, Nolan's family found themselves living in a reality that thousands of families facing unresolved deaths understand all too well. Every update brought hope, and every update created new questions. The independent autopsy had documented a finding that no one had publicly discussed before, but it hadn't provided the clear explanation the family had been searching for. Instead, it reinforced that important parts of the investigation were still incomplete. For Nolan's parents, that uncertainty carried a weight that cannot be measured by forensic reports or court filings. They had already endured the unimaginable loss of their son. Now they faced another kind of pain, the absence of definitive answers. Psychologists often describe this experience as ambiguous loss. It's the kind of grief that occurs when the facts surrounding a tragedy remain unresolved. Families aren't only mourning the person they've lost. They're also living with unanswered questions that prevent emotional closure. Every new report becomes both encouraging and frustrating. Encouraging because investigators are still working. Frustrating because each development reminds them that the complete picture has yet to emerge. For Nolan's family, the independent examination represented another step toward understanding what happened during his final hours. It didn't answer every question, but it ensured another qualified expert had carefully reviewed the available evidence. That pursuit of answers has remained at the center of everything the family has done since Nolan disappeared. Behind every press conference, every interview, and every request for additional review is the same simple goal: to know exactly what happened to their son. It's easy for investigations like this to become consumed by forensic terminology, laboratory testing, and legal procedures. But before Nolan became the subject of an active investigation, he was an 18-year-old with family, friends, teammates, and plans for the future. Those who knew him have consistently described him as someone who was kind, respectful, and deeply loved by the people around him. His death didn't just create an investigation. It left an empty seat at family gatherings, an empty place among friends, and a future that would never unfold. As public attention surrounding the case continued to grow, the family's search for answers began reaching far beyond Mississippi. High-profile civil rights attorney Ben Crump joined the family's legal team, bringing national attention to the investigation and calling for every available piece of evidence to receive thorough review. Organizations including the Knockup also expressed support for greater transparency as questions surrounding the case continued to circulate publicly. The family's legal representatives have consistently emphasized that they want the independent forensic findings evaluated alongside the state's investigation, not as competing conclusions, but as additional evidence deserving careful consideration. There have also been calls for increased transparency and requests that every investigative avenue remain open as the case progresses through the legal process, including future grand jury proceedings. Those requests should not be interpreted as conclusions about what happened. Rather, they reflect the family's position that a complete investigation requires every documented finding to be examined before final decisions are made. That brings us back to the discovery that changed the direction of this documentary. What does the investigation actually know today? The independent autopsy documented a 12 by 8-inch area of discoloration deep beneath the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. The examination did not identify skull fractures, widespread blunt force trauma, broken bones, or major external injuries. Several important neck structures were unavailable for independent examination because they had already been retained during the original autopsy. Toxicology results remained pending at the time of the independent report. Because the available evidence was still incomplete, the independent forensic pathologist classified both the cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. He also stated that he could not rule out foul play. Equally important, he did not conclude that foul play occurred. Those two statements are often presented as though they mean the same thing. They do not. One reflects uncertainty based on incomplete evidence. The other would require evidence sufficient to support a specific conclusion. That evidence has not been publicly established. Several critical questions therefore remain unanswered. What caused the discoloration beneath the back of Nolan's head? Did it occur before he entered the water, during the drowning process, after death, or during recovery? Would examination of the unavailable neck structures have provided additional answers? What will the toxicology findings ultimately reveal? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what exactly happened in the moments before Nolan entered the water? Those questions remain at the heart of the investigation. What this breakthrough changes is not the final answer. It changes the foundation of the investigation itself. For weeks, much of the public conversation revolved around conflicting memories, online theories, and competing interpretations of digital evidence. Now there is documented forensic evidence that investigators can continue evaluating as additional information becomes available. That doesn't close the case. It moves the investigation forward. The next significant developments will likely come from the completion of toxicology testing, continued forensic review, digital evidence analysis, and any future proceedings before a grand jury. Each verified finding will either strengthen existing conclusions or raise entirely new questions. Until then, the search for answers continues. As always, the most responsible approach is to let verified evidence, not speculation, guide the story. We'll continue following every confirmed development as it happens, separating documented facts from assumptions, and bringing you updates as investigators work toward answering the question that has remained since the very beginning. What really happened to Nolan Wells?